The way that the West lost faith in itself throughout COVID, its long-cherished beliefs, values, freedoms, cultural norms, political systems, and democratic structures, the way that all of that was simply binned to follow China's lead throughout COVID is potentially a worrying sign of things to come. The Council on Foreign Relations recently spoke about China's desire to make sure that it is at the center of the emerging world government, to make sure that as this global government emerges, it is at the apex, controlling and shaping the thing in its own image. It said, for more than 2 millennia, monarchs who ruled China proper saw their country as one of the dominant actors of the world. The concept of Zhongguo, Middle Kingdom as China calls itself, is not simply geographic. It implies that China is the cultural, political and economic center of the world. This Sinocentrist worldview has in many ways shaped China's outlook to global governance, the rules, norms and institutions that regulate international cooperation. The decline and collapse of imperial China in the 1800s and early 1900s, however, diminished Chinese influence on the global stage for more than a century. But in the past 2 decades, China has re-emerged as a major power. With the world's second largest economy and a world-class military, it increasingly asserts itself, seeking to regain its centrality in the international system and over global governance institutions. The institutions, created mostly by Western powers after World War II, include the World Bank, which provides loans and grants to developing states, the International Monetary Fund, which works to secure the stability of the global monetary system, and the United Nations, among others. President Xi Jinping, the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao Zedong, has called for China to lead the reform of the global governance system, transforming institutions and norms in ways that will reflect Beijing's values and priorities. China is pursuing a multi-pronged strategy towards global governance. It supports international institutions and agreements aligned with its goals and norms, such as the World Bank and the Paris Agreement on climate change, yet on issues in which Beijing diverges from the norms of the current system, such as human rights, it seeks to undermine those values and create alternative institutions and models. In areas where norms and institutions are still being established, such as internet governance, China works with other authoritarian powers, such as Russia, to create standards that reflect their interests. China has become a powerful force in global governance. Increasingly, its efforts appear to be deepening divides with other countries, particularly democracies, that are committed to existing norms and institutions. Ultimately, this divide can make it harder for states to collaboratively address major international challenges. The divide could even create 2 distinct systems of global governance, badly undermining multilateral cooperation. So this article talks about the way that China wants to mold and create the world government in its own image and some of the strategies it's using to achieve that. And for their part, China doesn't believe that 2 distinct systems are going to emerge on the global stage, at least not permanently. They believe that they will win the battle of ideas around what this global political system should look like. Indeed, China really only sees the West, with its freedoms and democratic traditions and values, going into complete decline in the postmodern age, while their own political system, their own autocratic system, will rise to dominate the world. China's English news website, the Global Times, the same channel the Chinese government used to taunt the West into adopting an authoritarian COVID response in 2020, makes no secret of the fact that it wants to rule the world in the postmodern age. In one article from the 13th of November 2021, they say, China has risen. We hold high the banner of people-centered socialism. The US and the West still regard their democracy as a hallmark, but their political systems have been seriously aging after hundreds of years. Western-style democracy is full of drawbacks, such as populism, political struggles, derailed people participation, and manipulated, misguided elections. Western-style democracy is still able to have its say in the international public arena is because of the economic and social strength accumulated in history. Those countries are still the most developed ones, which has helped them conceal their ugliness and fool the world with sophistries and cover-ups. However, some Western elites are now a little bit panicked. They know the West is plagued by problematic politics and a sluggish economy. Meanwhile, they've seen the fastest development of China. After the outbreak of COVID-19, China's people-first political ideology has quickly transformed to great achievements in fighting the epidemic. They worry that if this continues, the fundamental flaws in their narratives about democracy will be exposed, and the perception that their political systems are bad will spread throughout the world. The US and some Western countries in recent years have frantically increased their attacks on China's political system. Doing so is of no help to solve the decline of their own systems. So we have this idea that global governance is emerging, and the elites have two paths in front of them which they're discussing openly right now. Do they create world government in the democratic image of the United States, or do they create it in the autocratic image of China? China, for their part, feels pretty confident that the world will follow their lead and that democracy is on the way out. Here's US President Joe Biden talking about this, and also French President Emmanuel Macron.
My colleagues and heads of state, I know Brian Moynihan knows about this as well. We are not only being measured in terms of our strength and our reliability based upon the size of our military and or the physical strength that we possess, but it's on whether or not we can function. There's a great debate going on, and I'm not exaggerating this. All of you deal internationally. There's a great debate going on whether or not in the 21st century, in the second quarter of the 21st century, can democracies function with things moving so rapidly? And I can tell you, a couple of the folks I've had spent a lot of time with of late, Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi Jinping, they really believe that autocracies are the only way forward because they can act quickly and decisively. It's not a joke. And we're seeing effects of this around the world. And I don't know, it's understandable why the average American wouldn't understand what the consequences of this will be for American security and the willingness of other countries to follow our lead. We have always led the world, not just by the example of our power, but the power of our example. And that's going to be called into severe question. I mean, for real.
Are you on the US and the Chinese side? Because now, progressively, a lot of people would like to see there are two orders in this world. This is a huge mistake, even for both the US and China. We need a single global order.
So there's a discussion going on amongst the elites right now as to whether democracy, as is most visibly modelled by the US, is fit for purpose in the 21st century, or whether we should all be a bit more like China going forward. And many leaders are looking enviously at China right now and thinking they want that sort of control and power that Chinese leaders have. And this is why I said in the last episode that we crossed the Rubicon during COVID, because it was then that Western leaders looked at China's ability to make snap decisions and thought, we want that kind of power for ourselves. So the elites are discussing whether democracies can move fast enough to compete in general going forward in the future. And here's Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau showing where his sympathies lie and the kind of ruler that he would ideally want to be.
Trudeau's meeting last week with a group of Toronto women was an example. Even with Sun TV watching for any slip, he was asked which country he most admired and referred to China.
There's a level of admiration I actually have for China because their basic dictatorship is allowing them to actually turn their economy around on a dime and say, we need to go green as fast as we need to start, investing in solar. I mean, there is a flexibility that I know Stephen Harper must dream about of having a dictatorship that he could do everything he wanted, that I find quite interesting.
Don't forget that Justin Trudeau and Emmanuel Macron have been through the WEF Young Leaders program. These were a couple of the people name-checked by Klaus Schwab as having infiltrated the governments of the world. So we know where their allegiances lie and we know the way that they're thinking because, of course, the WEF, to refresh our memories, is the organization that believes that in the future we're all going to own nothing and be happy about it. So George Orwell was right when he said that the real division is not between conservatives and revolutionaries, but between authoritarians and libertarians. That is indeed the biggest battle of our time. That is what the culture war is really all about. It's about freedom and democracy versus autocracy and state control. Now, globalism is happening, and I do believe a world government is inevitable because, well, The Bible tells us it's going to happen one day. And I've often said that the next lurch forward will probably happen through an existential crisis like a financial collapse or World War III. But the question that's emerging right now is, what kind of world government will emerge on the other side? Will it be a democratic one in the image of the United States? Or will China succeed in molding it in their authoritarian image? And already, leaders of the world are showing where their sympathies lie. They're showing that they're being drawn towards the Chinese model because it means power and control and the ability to make snap, quick decisions. Now, the problem that we have right now in the West is not so much that China's feeling confident about its abilities to shape world government in its own image, because there have often been threats in the past to freedom and democracy from rising powers. But you see, the thing that kept the West strong in the past was that we knew who we were. We knew what we stood for in the past, what we believed in, what we had faith in. We knew it was worth fighting for, and when the time came, we were willing to fight for it. The problem today, however, is that the West no longer has that confidence in itself. The left in the West, often the leftist academics in the West, have for some decades now been undermining our values, our sense of ourself, attempting to make Westerners feel shame for who we are and for what we stand for and what we believe in. They've been destroying from within our sense of nationhood and identity and our local loyalties and our faith. And I think most profoundly of all, the West has lost faith in God. It's turned away from Christianity, and that above everything else has profoundly weakened the fabric of our society. So the West no longer knows what it stands for, what it believes. And as a result, the West is weakening and crumbling from within. And that's the real problem here. It's that fifth column within our society that even agrees with China, that China does have the answers for a better society and for the one world government. The amount of people who believe in communism in the West is now growing. So in other words, the problem today is not that China is growing strong, it's that we're growing weak. It's that we're crumbling from within and losing faith in ourselves and in what we believe and in what we stand for. And this is primarily why the Chinese model for world government is becoming such a threat today. Instead of opposing Chinese narratives, as we would have in the past, our leaders today are copying those narratives. During COVID, not only did our leaders copy Chinese lockdowns and treat the whole nation as prisoners, but we also saw people losing jobs because they wouldn't take an experimental vaccine. Austria announced compulsory vaccines, injecting people with substances they didn't want against their will. Australia established detention camps for the unvaccinated. You could hardly imagine anything more dystopian than a state feeling it should have the power to inject innocent citizens with a substance against their will and locking them up for non-compliance. And yet this was happening in the West. Once the home of freedom and democracy, we saw the worst kinds of authoritarianism creeping in these places. Indeed, now the elites have had a taste of all of these powers, these Chinese-style powers. A precedent has been set, and they've decided, do you know what, we actually quite like this power. Maybe we can keep this power and keep it going and extend it into other areas of life. So although it's not a Western state, in November 2021, the Indian government announced that it was going to impose a lockdown on New Delhi, not for the virus this time, but because of heavy air pollution. If you can lock down people for a virus, then why not another emergency? In March 2021, UK Green Party peer Baroness Jenny Jones called for all men to be locked down after 6 p.m. so that women could feel safer at night. This was in the wake of the murder of Sarah Everard. After all, if you can lock down people for one kind of problem, then why not other kinds of problems?
And in the week that the woman Sarah Everard was abducted and we suppose killed because remains have been found in a woodland in Kent, I would argue that at the next opportunity for any bill that's appropriate, I might actually put in an amendment to create a curfew for men on the streets after 6 p.m, which I feel would make women a lot safer.
The elites are warming to the idea of these Chinese-style powers. They didn't realize that they had this. They didn't realize that Western people would accept this kind of authoritarianism, but now they know they can use them. They quite like this. Where else can we use these powers? So how long before lockdowns are being suggested for climate change reasons or the next so-called emergency. You can see how a dangerous door was unlocked by following China during COVID and how it's rocked faith in democracy itself. Many world leaders are now wondering aloud whether modelling itself on China might be the best way forward for government. And many citizens in the West, this is the most shocking thing, many citizens in the West are now open to living under authoritarianism. They want it. Throughout COVID, we often had polls and surveys where people demanded more lockdowns. Harsher lockdowns, stricter lockdowns. They demanded that the government lock them up inside their houses. And what we also saw was that the authoritarian instinct which exists on the left in general and which simmers only just beneath the surface is ready to come out when people won't conform to state narratives. It shouldn't be forgotten that it took just a little nudge of fear for the left to start justifying tyranny. It took just a little bit of fear for the face of the left to really reveal itself. It took a little bit of fear for the left to start saying and doing things like this. The instinct is now growing in the left that when people won't conform and do what they're told and give up their individual freedom for complete social cohesion, tyranny is an acceptable response to that. They think that freedom comes second to complete social conformity. Close your mouths, do what you're told. And again, that's the real problem here. Not that Chinafication is being mooted, it's that in far too many places in the West now, it's actively being welcomed.